Alright, cool. What's up, YouTube? Today I'm going to be reading comments from our last video. I know reading the comments is usually a really bad idea, but I'm doing it anyway.
Let's do this.
The Sorcerer. Guns shouldn't exist. There's no way to make them realistic without being way too overpowered and deal way too much damage. Also the Sorcerer. I cast Fireball. In every situation. Yeah, that's about right. Guns being lethal always suffers from one major misconception. You are not your character. You are a commoner with 4 HP. No RPG weapon is particularly realistic, and while guns do more damage than an arrow, a single arrow can take a real person out of a fight just as easily as a single bullet. My thought on realistic damage. A commoner has 4 health. A 1d8 pistol will give that commoner a 3 out of 8 chance of survival, assuming that you don't also have an ability modifier as well. But yes, all of this. D&D is an abstraction from reality. While modern firearms are particularly deadly, at the same time, nobody's able to survive getting stabbed 50 times as easily as adventurers are. It also stands to reason that an adventurer, or a dragon, would be better able to survive getting shot. I've also seen the suggestion for using dexterity saves for weapon attack rolls before, and just treat it as if you would a weapon hit. This would be an interesting way to kind of get that whole touch AC feel that you remember from 3.5 in Pathfinder. This could make things a little weird because then the player is making an attack roll, but they're not the one rolling the dice. In addition, you'd probably want to include a clause that mentions that this does make the weapon count as a hit, if they fail the save. However, this also means that you can't get critical hits unless you also add in a clause for that, like they have to get an @ 1.
Play Pathfinder, you filthy casuals.
Solution to play firearms that are both cool and balanced, play Pathfinder 2.
Or just play Pathfinder.
The best way to put guns in D&D is to play Pathfinder anyway. Yeah, you guys got the point of the video. Sorta. 5e is, again, what's most popular in the algorithm, and it's what most people play, and it's also the system that people usually want to homebrew a lot. See, the thing is, you don't get a lot of rule rewrites for Pathfinder 1 and Pathfinder 2 especially, because the rules are actually really solid in those systems. 5e, due to its own constraints as well as its vagueness, usually winds up getting more rules homebrew than the other systems. It'd be a little disingenuous to just make a video that says, hey, just go play Pathfinder 2 or Pathfinder 1, because they do guns better. It's kind of a bit demeaning and disingenuous suggestion. If they really like 5e, they should still be able to play 5e. I think it's absolutely worthwhile to broaden your horizons and try out other systems, but that has to be something that you have to do on your own terms. Yes, I think they should try the Pathfinder systems because I think they're pretty great systems, but at the same time, I know a lot of them are going to stick with 5e because it's what's popular and it's what's played on Critical Role. And 5e does have a lot of its strengths. It's a really approachable system, and I do still like it. And there are some issues that I have with Pathfinder 1 and 2, such as it feels like Pathfinder 1, all the classes are designed in a vacuum, and there's no interactions between them that is thought about in their design, which winds up leading to a lot of really broken combinations and archetypes. Heck, I played a Beast Morph Vivisectionist, and it felt like literally I was completely upsetting the entire balance of the game. Pathfinder 2 also has a few issues with, like, its 3-action economy, which I normally love, does also feel like it incorporates a lot of what I call action taxes. And then 5e wants everything to be constrained by advantage and disadvantage and doesn't want to give any incremental bonuses to anything and instead tries to simplify everything to the point of monotony. But yeah, the video is basically about 5e because 5e is the one that needs the help. Pathfinder 1 and 2 don't need help figuring out how firearms work because their systems are really fucking good. The heavy property is very balanced. It has great weapon master, which no other weapon type has. Why is the heavy property badly designed? I feel a bit out of the loop. I'd like to hear more about why you don't like the heavy property. Is it just because it stops strong, short-stack goblins from wielding great axes?
Yes.
So, it has nothing to do with Great Weapon Master. The heavy property is basically implemented as a means to try and enforce weapon size rules, which were abandoned largely for 5e except for NPCs. Back in 3.5 in Pathfinder, weapons had different sizes that varied in their weapon die. For instance, a halfling would need a small-sized pike or greatsword or whatever if they wanted to use one, but they were able to use one still. And as they got bigger weapons, you could basically get all the way up to like gargantuan-sized weapons, and the weapon die would gradually get bigger, not a significant increase. You also still could wield oversized weapons for you up to a limit. Like a medium character could wield a large weapon, but not a huge weapon necessarily, unless they had certain perks that allowed them to do that. And there was the drawback of, hey, you take a penalty to your hit on these attacks. Not as steep as outright disadvantage, but still a noticeable penalty. 5e, however, didn't want to make a table for this kind of thing because they don't want players to have to reference things to figure out how strong something is, and they wanted to universalize everything. But for some reason, they still wanted players to only have the larger weapons be usable by medium creatures. So they implemented the heavy property, which is a very bad band-aid to try and implement weapon size rules on a system where players cannot interact with weapon sizes, which is really stupid. And there's also the issue of, in the DMG, they do mention that NPCs that have larger weapons simply add an additional damage die entirely. So basically the heavy property exists because 5e was shot itself in the foot when it was trying to make weapon size rules and decided that they weren't going to, and they decided to half-ass implement them. I've seen a lot of people talk about Shadversity's video about where, well, it has to do less with a matter of how strong you would be and more about how well you could wield the weapon and how cumbersome it would be in your center of... It doesn't matter, it's a fucking fantasy game. There's already so many abstractions from reality that this would not be a big deal. Let the goblin use a great axe, goddammit. Anyway, it just comes off as an arbitrary restriction, and the change that I would make would be to have the heavy property instead have a strength requirement instead. It doesn't necessarily have to be a steep cost, like you could still leave the heavy property on a longbow and then require it to have only like 11 strength, but it would enforce some MAD, which would help curb some of the more powerful options in the game. And again, adventurers are supposed to be exceptional. I think you should be allowed to have a halfling, or a gnome, or a goblin, or a kobold that uses a glaive, or a great axe, or a greatsword. I don't think that is that immersion breaking. And if you're not going to do that, then give players a way to manipulate weapon sizes so they can equip themselves with an appropriately sized weapon instead of having to be limited being a small character in a medium-sized world. Heck, if this was that much of an issue, you'd think that gnomes would invent like some kind of super light lance or something. There were also a lot of comments that were kind of commenting about how what they would implement for guns and stuff, saying like, well, obviously you would implement muskets and stuff. Like, yes, that's not really what the video is about. The video is about how to implement the thing, not what it is. And it's how to basically tie the thematics of what you're implementing in and how to make the mechanics reflect the thematics, because that's the most important consideration. The video was never meant to be like, oh, what kind of guns could you implement into a fantasy setting? No, that's obvious. There's already so many examples of that. It's also not meant to be like, okay, here's how you make guns. Well, there was some section about things you could implement to create your guns. It was more meant to be about what questions you need to ask yourself before you decide what approach you want for your guns. The point was basically considering what themes you wanted your guns to represent. It's not a matter of what is possible or feasible. It's all about what accomplishes the goals that you have in mind. The other thing as well is that I also saw a lot of comments commenting about very complicated rulings for how they would implement firearms, which that's kind of besides the point of what I was trying to make, because 5e, again, is not very friendly to complicated rulings. You want to try and keep it simple and try to keep the weapon properties fairly linear. Again, one of the ideas that I did mention is that you want to avoid incremental bonuses. I saw somebody incorporating some kind of random formula in order to determine whether or not a weapon would hit, and it involved like multiplication and an arbitrary value of like 70 and things like that, and it's like, that's not something that 5e would ever implement. I mean, you can implement it, and if your players are fine with it, more power to you, but for general use, like, I like to think about homebrew about how I would make it to try and offer it to other people. And that kind of homebrew is not going to be something you can offer to anybody else. That would be strictly for your table only. Again, 5e at its core is very simple, and you gotta try and embody that with when you make homebrew for it. One other thing I forgot to mention, and this is kind of a big issue, and it's my main gripe with why I don't like the idea of using an entire action to reload. 5e is much more constrained by its action economy than other systems. It is very, very fixed. It's not like Pathfinder where you had multiple action types you could take, and where you could choose to not move and take a full attack action to make multiple attacks as any class. Instead, extra attacking is just something that is part of your action, and different characters, like martial characters and stuff, can do that more often. Especially fighters, where they can make up to 4 attacks by level 20. And the problem with an action to reload is you wind up getting into the situation where, say, a fighter that is specializing in firearms, as they level up, because they have to use their action to reload, that action winds up being more costly to them. They're no longer giving up 1 attack whenever they reload. Once they reach level 5, they're now giving up 2 attacks. And when they reach level 11, they're now giving up 3 attacks every single time they reload. And then when they reach level 20, they're giving up 4 attacks whenever they reload. Why should they get less efficient with their firearms as they level up? This wouldn't be an issue if everybody had the same amount of attacks that they could make on their turn when they took the attack action, but that is not the case in 5e. That is why I don't like using actions to reload, and why I think replacing actions with attacks to reload is probably a better choice. That makes the trade-off fairly linear and consistent across different classes and stuff. Seems to be a weird penalty to impose upon a fighter where they're less able to meet their damage potential as they level up. And the fighter of all characters should be the one that's best with the firearms, I would say. Surprised you didn't mention Matt Mercer's Gunslinger. Confession time, I've never actually looked at Matt Mercer's Gunslinger. I don't have any interest in looking at Matt Mercer's Gunslinger. I don't actually have any interest in Matt Mercer himself. He's a great guy, I'm sure of it. But I don't care about Critical Role or anything like that. I know this is heresy. But, if I remember correctly, Critical Role originally started in Pathfinder, and I believe that the Gunslinger that Matt Mercer's implemented is based on the Pathfinder Gunslinger itself. Regardless, however, I don't like the idea of making guns a class feature. I want guns, if they're going to be in my game, I want them to be equipment that all players can use. You can have a character that's better at using them, but I want them to be available to everybody instead of a specialized tool that only one character can use. And that is the core philosophy behind Matt Mercer's Gunslinger that I kind of don't really like. The only reason why so many of the things I suggested look like they were from Matt Mercer himself is because he also adopted them from Pathfinder, which, as I mentioned repeatedly, was a big source of inspiration and something that you should look at if you want to implement firearms. Alright, that's I think about all I'm going to read for today. I've never done a video like this before, but it was kind of interesting. I wonder how many of my followers were surprised at the notion of me making a D&D video, implying they hadn't seen one of my earlier ones. I also wonder how many people were surprised to find this D&D video and then check my channel for more, and then they got all the animation stuff that I've made. And sauce. But that about does it for the comments that I'm going to respond to.
Anyway, that's the end of this video. Be sure to rate the video, comment the video, and subscribe for more videos similar to this one. See ya.